for doctors who treat Medicare patients. They get paid by Medicare. And if we hadn't fixed this time, they would have taken about a 28% cut in their reimbursement, which would influence their willingness to participate in Medicare. At the end of this year, that was only extended through the end of this year. So that we would have to do the doc fix again. And there are a number of other little things like that, including some other tax, what we call tax extenders. So my point is, in the immediate aftermath of the election, all these events are going to converge, and there are two possible outcomes. One is you could have a total mess, and I can't predict it. The other is you see this as an opportunity to deal with the deficit in a balanced way and solve some of these problems that include not just revenue, but some reforms to some of the other programs, Medicaid, Medicare, very different views on how you do that. The Republican proposal puts all the costs and risks on the Medicare beneficiaries. But I don't want to get into a long discussion on that. But my point is, it is a forcing event where you could have a grand bargain type solution. But a grand bargain requires a balanced approach. Balanced approach means you have to have revenue. I cannot project a scenario where you get a balanced approach if the President of the United States is not reelected. And I'm just saying that as an observer. Because you cannot run an election, on an absolutely no new tax and revenue platform and turn around after a read my lips, no new taxes moment, and within 2 months have a balanced approach to deficit reduction. And I just think, I mean, if someone can give me a scenario where that can happen, I'd be interested in hearing how it works. But so that's my concern is, and I think we can all hope that that convergence of events results in a responsible outcome for the country rather than a mess that would have very bad results for federal agencies, and more important, because of that, their inability to do important work for the country and the American people.
Well, thank you very much for that. Do you have time to take
Sure. I'm sorry. I was not. We house guys don't filibuster. Sure.
Okay, I want to turn right to questions. And Ian, do you want, or Paul, who's going to take the first question? Who are we going to call on here? It's tough.
Step up. Either, I suppose for time,
yes.
Just take it from the floor.
Yeah, please, just take it from the floor, sir, and then we'll come over here.
Hello, I am one of your old and new constituents. I don't think this is on.
Yeah, it is. We can hear you.
My question is about how we as citizens influence you after you're elected. For example, I get all kinds of mailings from organizations like AARP with pre-filled out petitions to send to you and our 2 senators. AFSA just the other day had something very similar, asking us to send an urgent email. Can't remember what it was about. And so on and so on. Do these things have any effect on you when you receive them?
Well, as the son of a diplomat, I would say yes and no. No, seriously. The answer is, if you have a large volume of, letters, statements from a group of your constituents on an issue, yes, of course, you pay attention. It's a factor that goes into the decision-making process. Now, I should hasten to add one little caveat to that. There are many occasions where people will sign on to a robo-email, and I'm not referring to the one you just signed, obviously, but they don't know. I mean, you can have someone from our office call them back and ask them their view on that issue, and they'll have no clue as to what they signed. And so, frankly, if I got like 5 handwritten letters from people on one issue that showed that they were original and had given some real thought to an issue, that would have a bigger impact on me than a mass robo thing where people might just have pushed a button and didn't, and in many cases really don't know. I mean, there are doctors who go, if you're a patient at their office, they'll have a petition on the side. Every patient signs this petition, they don't even read it. So That's one now. And in an email age, of course, when you get a lot more communications through email, yeah, you have to try and differentiate which are just sort of push the button, and which are writing you an email. I should say that the district I represent is unique in a lot of ways, which is that we get 3-page, well-thought-out memos with a recommendation at the end, and you don't want to argue with you know what they're talking about. So that is something that is a little unique to this area. There are times when my staff wish they represented a congressional district way off some other place. But I will say, we actually learn. There are many occasions where we learn something very important, not just a well thought out opinion, which is very important, but something, a whole new idea on something that we often pursue.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's go with you, sir.
Will Embry, also from the 8th District. There's just one more option that you didn't talk about in dealing with sequester, and that is a reform of the tax code. Personally, I think that there are things in tax code that ought to be fixed, and there's a way to get to a different bottom line by doing the tax code. What's the, everybody has his own tax savings you want to keep. What's the real possibility of having some tax code reform?
Sure. And I should clarify what I said. When I talk about a balanced approach that includes revenue, certainly that revenue can be generated from tax reform. And we actually spent a good amount of time on the Joint Committee, Super Committee, trying to explore different tax reform proposals. The big difference in general approaches to tax reform is our Republican colleagues were willing to look at tax reform, but only revenue neutral, that did not help reduce the deficit, versus tax reform as suggested by Simpson Bowles or Rivlin Domenici, that not only had tax reform, but contributed some of the proceeds to reduce the deficit. I mean, in fact, just a matter of a point, the Simpson Bowles number in terms of the revenue generated as part of that plan, as a percent of GDP, they get more revenue than the president's current budget. So anybody who tells you, the president's got this big, tax and spend budget compared to bipartisan Simpson Bowles, he actually has less revenue as a percent of GDP. I believe that the way we're going to get there ultimately is through tax reform. But there are lots of different flavors to tax reform. There are certainly, well, let's talk about the corporate side for a second, because the president put out at least some principles, so have some Republican colleagues put out some principles. The idea on corporate tax reform has really, on a bipartisan basis, been primarily to do it on a deficit neutral basis, corporate tax. And the United States right now is in a situation where our top tax corporate rate is very high compared to our international competitors. We're at 35%. That's our corporate tax rate. I think there's only one other country that is higher in terms of the top rate. Now, the important qualification is the effective tax rate paid by U.S. corporations is actually lower than a lot of our international. So how does that happen? Well, it happens because you have a lot of loopholes. You have a lot of loopholes, exceptions. Loopholes is obviously a pejorative term, but there are things in the tax code that are well-intended incentives. But you have to choose ultimately whether you want to have some of these incentives in the tax code or eliminate those incentives and reduce the rate. And then it gets very complicated on the international corporate tax piece, because you want to design it in a way that allows our U.S. corporations to compete effectively overseas, but not give them incentives to move their operations and American jobs overseas. And we've got to shut down some of these tax havens that in my view, encourage, our tax system sometimes encourages that movement at the margins. On the individual tax side, there you have the same situation. If you want to lower rates, you've got to, if you want to do it if you want to do it in a revenue neutral way, or you want to generate revenue, you're still closing. And this is where I hasten to say loopholes is probably not the appropriate term, because I don't think anyone would characterize their mortgage interest deduction as a loophole. It's a policy preference expressed in the tax code. It is what we call a tax expenditure. Charitable deductions are in the same category. In fact, if you look at the three biggest so-called tax expenditure in the U.S. tax code, they're charitable deductions, mortgage interest, and the fact that you don't pay a tax on your employer-provided health care. If that,
Is mortgage going away?
nothing's going away. First of all, there's no proposal now for mortgage. No. So my only point is that when you're dealing with tax reform on the individual side, you want to reduce the rates, you're going to expand the base. Pretty simple calculation. And Simpson-Bowles did that. I mean, Simpson-Bowles got rid of big parts of the mortgage interest deduction. They essentially got rid of essentially have you counting your health benefit as income. And then there are other things in the tax code that just, we have an anomaly where right now our capital, the main reason for the fact that people at the very high end of the income scale pay a much lower effective rate than everybody else has to do with the treatment of capital gains taxes and dividends. Capital gains taxes right now are taxed at 15%. This is where you get the Buffett rule, right? I mean, that's why Warren Buffett pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary. Most of his income is in the form of capital gains, which is taxed at 15%. And most of his people who work for him are wages, and so they have a higher tax rate on it. So, when they did tax reform in 1986 under President Reagan, they taxed all income, capital gains and non-capital gains equally at 28%. So, my point is there are lots of ways to go. This is a complicated area, and we need to figure out a way to get there. But tax reform, I think, if you're going to get, no, I see, Ken, I'm sorry. If you're going to get a balanced approach in a bipartisan way, my view is tax reform's got to be part of the answer. So, I can take a couple.
Okay, let's say there's one over here. We'll take this, John. One over here and then one here.
All right, let me
and that's, yeah, two questions.
take 3 more, and I'll be much quicker. It's my fault.
Okay. Keith, why don't you let this, what's it say? Home hold back. Board members hold back. So we'll let, go ahead, please.
Well, I think the healthcare part of this is really important, and I don't know how it's going to fit with the other legs. And, what's your view on it?
You mean as part of the tax reform or part of like Medicare and Medicaid?
I'm talking about Medicare.
Right, right.
And the whole healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to build a whole new healthcare, or because I'm looking at figures that are almost de minimis. We're getting healthcare almost for free in a way, and that's the way I see it in my taxes too.
Well, I said I was going to answer in short, but I'm not sure I can answer. So, well, we certainly have a tax system that subsidizes health care, for starters. That's true. As you probably know, I mean, that grew out of, after World War II, there were wage and price controls, and then people began to provide compensation in the form of health care, and that was then not taxed. And so one of the things we did in the Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Reform Bill, that actually does bend the cost curve over a period of time, is for very what we call Cadillac health plans. They will begin to be taxed beginning around 2017, and that will, over time, have reduce that subsidy, and that will mean people will make healthcare decisions a little bit more based on the actual cost rather than the subsidized cost. That's one, and that applies to private health plans. With respect to Medicare, and I should quickly add that the challenges with rising costs in Medicare are a result of rising costs throughout the healthcare system. And in fact, if you look at a chart of the increase in costs of Medicare over time compared to the increase in cost in the private health sector. Medicare actually does a little bit better. I mean, their costs actually increase at a slightly lower rate than the private health market. So the real answer to this problem is to try and reduce the growth of healthcare costs overall, which in both Medicare and non-Medicare are growing much faster than inflation. And so that's the challenge for the budget. They're growing faster than inflation. In fact, they grow faster than GDP. So what the Affordable Care Act did, in addition to the piece that I just talked about, had a number of other provisions. But within Medicare, it began to change the incentive structure within Medicare to try and focus more on the quality of care over the quantity of care. And I'll just give you one quick example. And these are things that are now being tested, and we'll see whether they work. They're called accountable care organizations. So I'll give you one example. In Medicare, you get sick. If you get sick, you go in the hospital gets paid, right? Let's say you have some condition. Hospital gets paid. They tell you, okay, we're going to go home, but you got to take these medicines, you got to do this therapy. You got to do this in order to make sure you get better. The hospital's been paid. There's nobody in the healthcare system at this point in time who has any incentive to follow up with you, the patient. So you don't take your medicine, you don't do what you're told. You're back in the hospital in something related to the same condition. Hospital gets paid again. And so the whole idea behind some of these Affordable Care Acts was to change the incentives in the payment system to, for example, in this case, prevent more hospitalization, which is very expensive. And there are lots of examples of it. That's one approach. The other approach is what you'll see in the Republican budget, which is that it doesn't reduce the health care costs in the system. It transfers the risk of costs from the Medicare patient, from the Medicare system to the Medicare patient. You get a voucher, and the value, you're going to go out and buy your health care plan on the private market now, but the only catch is that the value of that voucher you get is going to diminish steadily over time compared to the rising costs of health care. So you're saving the Medicare system money, but you're doing it simply by transferring all the costs onto the Medicare patient. And the median income of a Medicare senior on Medicare in the United States is under $23,000. Median income.
Okay, so we had one more here, and that's it. Don't freak out, Ken.
As a constituent, first, I want to thank you for your great staff. A few years back, when there's total constipation getting passports, the only way this ex-foreign service officer got his family to Europe was your front office staffer, whose name I don't remember.
Shar Rosnick.
She's wonderful.
See, guys, it was worth staying for you guys.
She just made it happen.
Well, don't forget the people in the passport office in which we were part
Thank you. Yeah,
Give her my regards.
Work in the
passport office, you know,
but I couldn't call on any of my colleagues who are out here to get the passport to do it for me. Your office did. Thank you.
Thank you.
A couple quick observations. One is when you take a look at stacked decks in terms of surveys that find the Foreign Service not worthy of the benefits it's getting, I want to remind people that when we passed the Foreign Service Act, negotiated it in 1980, 32 years ago, built into that, Jim Leach had a legislative requirement for a survey by, I've forgotten, McKinsey or one of the big groups on pay comparability study. And that got us all a very substantial raise at the time. I'm not arguing for raises here and now. I don't think anybody is. But when and if the Dems have a chance to put something in that'll pass out of the House, it might be useful to say, let's do another pay comparability study that looks to comparing apples to apples in terms of job responsibilities.
It's a good idea. I didn't know Jim Leach had that.
Yeah, it worked.
Yeah.
You know, put $5,000 in my pocket, which is real money. Last, I just throw out one other thought in terms of comparability. The military, God love them, have a very justified exception to the you can't retire and then come back to work for the federal government again. We have them working in the State Department, a bunch of former colonels who are doing great jobs.
it strikes me that with an upload system the way we have done it, and it should be working with a degree of vigor, that would be a very useful thing to get applied to the Foreign Service. We could, particularly so we could get some people working up on the Hill in early retirement. All of us are too old, but, you know, to get our wheelchairs up there, but some of the other people may have to make it.
No, I'm glad we're looking at that. Thanks for raising that.
And I should say, former Secretary Schultz, with whom we met a couple weeks ago in Palo Alto, is very strong on that. He thinks there's an enormous waste of talent in the
Yeah,
federal government, and because of these restrictions, it's not a jobs program for the federal employee. It's a benefit for the federal government and the taxpayer, because you're going to get much better qualified, less expensive labor that can, do the job more quickly and go away without having to worry about health care, pension, all the other things.
Absolutely.
So, well, I promised Ken we wouldn't have any more questions. I want to ask everybody to join with me in really extending a
Thank you.
I mean, it really helps to have someone